A few remarks, first to Ute and then to Jenny, and then to Jenny. First of all, there were very good, comprehensive accounts of a very complicated, convoluted story with many ups and downs. Now, Ute talked about the few players. She mentioned a few players. There were no more. There were a few players. They were the protagonists. And she also emphasized the incentives of the players on both sides, noble incentives. But they would not have been enough, and that was not sufficiently emphasized, if there were not a political conducive situation that helped that. Because there were two periods in this Adenauer-Ben-Gurion relations. The first, Germany wanted to establish diplomatic relations. Ben-Gurion and we were not ready for that yet. Later, it was reversed. But then Germany was not ready because of the Hallstein Doctrine and many other. And this support for science was in a way perceived in the German higher circles as a compensation, one of two compensations. The other one was a secret arms deal, but that is not part of our story, but this was it. And it was not so simple, because initially the Max Planck Institute was against it. Telschow played a very, very important role there. And it was a pressure that was imposed on the Max Planck Institute to go into that. So we cannot discuss this without the context of the political situation. That is one thing. And to Jenny, I want to say, yes, you are right. There was a time, and this is a turning point, where the whole thing proliferated. And we could not exaggerate by pointing out the very special role of DFG. Because all the money that was channeled through Max Planck initially was exclusively for the Weizmann Institute. Then there was an initiative by the representatives of the DFG, and I'm pointing at Christoph Miller here. He knows the story, and he provided the most interesting documents for us showing this thing. There is a letter from the president of the Hebrew University, who was a diplomat, Abraham Harman, to Nahum Goldman, who was then the president of the World Jewish Congress, a graduate of Heidelberg University, very good German contacts, urging him to approach the government and to talk to them that DFG would be another channel, like the Max Planck Institute, that would support universities and other disciplines. That did not work. There was a heroic decision by Julius Spree, the president of the DFG, to do it from their own funds. So this is something which, the importance of this, in this turning point, in this proliferation, cannot be exaggerated, should be pointed out.
Could you pass the mic to, yeah, thank you.
I'm going to make three short points. First of all, concerning the question of Ben Sasson, whom you, I think, mischaracterized as an Islamic historian. He's really a historian of medieval Jewish life in Egypt. And the reason this is so important is because one of the things we have not observed in our project, but we should keep it in our eyes, is the question of Jewish studies in Germany, of the different centers for Jewish studies, and how is that part of the background landscape of what we do. Now, the Jewish studies in Germany function isometrically, I would say, to the permanent Minerva centers in Israel, in the sense that they are enclaves. In other words, they work as enclaves. They're self-contained. It isn't that they have as far as I can tell, a larger public role. And I think that the same issue has to be raised vis-a-vis the three permanent German centers here, that's to say Rosenzweig, the one in Tel Aviv, and Köbner, which is of their larger public role in affecting the intellectual discourse in society, because I think that's one of the aims of the project, is to find out not only that we established a German center or this or that, but what actually was produced and how did that affect the intellectual climate of the countries in questions. And I think that question has to be raised in both directions, and one has to be sensitive that Jewish studies in Germany is not quite the same as German studies in Israel, despite the apparent structural similarity. Now, two technical points. One technical point about this 11% for the humanities. The highest I know of is the ERC, which gives 16% of its money for the humanities and social sciences. This was a number chosen out of a hat by Helga Novotny. And it was chosen out of a hat, and then she had sleepless nights because she wanted to make sure that at least 16% of the applications were in the humanities and social sciences. It has to be seen, humanists and social scientists traditionally don't only apply for smaller grants, but I can tell you as somebody who's involved in university administration as Dean of the Humanities, it was very hard to get them to apply for money because they didn't want to do it, not because of anti-German things, because that's not the way that there's a transition in the humanities and social sciences from individual work to group work, and people are along the spectrum. Most applications for money are very often for group work. Now, thirdly, this question of matching, which was brought up, and I want to just specify the history of that for a second. When many of these centers were set up, there was a high interest rate, and the universities could provide out of different funds in relation to high interest rates. Interest rates fell, and the Israelis were caught with a budget deficit where they could not match the German contribution because of that. So they invented a wonderful concept called matching in kind, which is the offices, the typewriters, the fact that the buildings, all of this was amortized as part of the matching. Now, the Minerva has officially now recognized matching in kind. In other words, because they saw that this was a helpless thing, that in our conversations with Minerva, what they do is they say 60% money, 40% matching in kind. So in effect, it means that in such projects, you get a 100 to 60, or you get a 5 to 3 distribution of money. And even that, I don't know if it bears further closer investigation than that. But it's something very important to see that Israeli universities were cash-strapped at different times than the Germans have been cash-strapped. And because of that, there's an asymmetry in funding between the two sides, and because this was all done informally, there's no such thing as a smoothing formula. Yeah. Smoothing formula would be to suggest that one partner provide more money in the year in which they have more money, and the other partner provide more money in the year in which they have the money. And you could have formulas like that. We have one with our international funder here at Van Leer. So these are technical points, but I think they're important because they contribute to understanding the structure of what happened.
You're next. If you don't mind, I'm not going after the time when you raise your arm, but we'll just make the round.
Okay, so I have to pass this
Yes,
on.
please do.
Yeah.
And short.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Christoph Mühlberg. I was heavily involved in all this, what you are discussing, since 1990. I want to add a word on politicization. What Hanoch Gutfreund says, in fact, is important in the sense that it opened a line of non-political support for German-Israeli cooperation, funded not from government, but from the DFG fund. And the trilateral cooperation, and that is my point, is a development from this, and it was not the government that was involved, and it was the idea of the Israelis to start this type of cooperation in order to broaden the engagement of bottom-up scientific funding to the cooperation. So this is important. Max Planck and Minerva is also not really political, but Minerva money is dedicated only to German-Israeli cooperation. Now, one remark, because I was a member of the Max Planck administration in the 1980s, and I already noted that there was a lot of affection within this Minerva cooperation, real friendship. Scientists who visited Israel for 30, 40, 50 times, very often in relation to the Minerva centers, And what comes out nowadays is a kind of nostalgia of these cooperations of the 1960s and 70s. And I think the challenge to the science organizations, including foundations, is that this kind of close cooperation with friendship continues, that it is given to the following generations. Those people like Smilansky or so, they of course fade out, still there, but sometimes also are no longer there. But the important challenge to foundations and organizations, be it political, like GIF, in a sense also independent, or DFG or Max Planck, is that they take care of the young generations. That is the future of the German-Israeli cooperation. Thank you.
Okay, please hand the mic to Yvette, and then it's Mitch, and then it's Jürgen Kocher, and then we'll close.
I'll try to do it very, very short. And first of all, thank you, both of you. It was extremely interesting. And just to say that I started to be aware to the fact that we have a I don't know if a problem, but a topic that we didn't talked about when we started our project. We were of course aware that it is very hard to evaluate success in a sense, or it will be very hard to evaluate the question if money makes an impact, and in which kind of impact, and intended and unintended. But we were not aware enough to the fact that it's extremely hard to evaluate our own positions relating this topic, and we are always, and all of us, and the people who talked and the people you interviewed, very one-sided in effect. And I will bring only a very small example and leave it like this. I think we will have to take it back to our project and think about it. Matching in kind. Is it a kind of bluffing, or is it an absolutely legitimate thing? And I think it's absolutely legitimate. And why do I think that it's legitimate? Because the moment Germany invested in science in Israel, it influenced actually our internal planning. All of a sudden, French history, you always talk about it, Gabi, but not only French history, all other topics in the humanities had to make place for the German topics. So if the Hebrew University thought that it's fine to give these offices, for example, and this means that structurally the university changed according to a German investment and changed in a radical way, which influenced in a radical way the future generation. Once we look in the number of PhD projects and doctorate, and we will see that all of a sudden more of a half, and even more so, are dealing with German history. So we moved in a way. So can you count it only on the base of so to say, euro for shekel? No, of course not. You have to count it in a different manner. This would be, so to say, one example among many other examples. How to evaluate the fact that on the one side, we, the Rosenzweig Center in Jerusalem, have a seminar in German weekly. Actually, it's very untypical that, I mean, the last year we had actually almost a weekly seminar in German, where Israelis and Germans and others discuss in German, Germans and German Jewish topics, while Jewish studies in Germany will always discuss, I guess, in English or in German. I cannot imagine a seminar taking place in Berlin in Hebrew, even though Hebrew is one of the most, I don't want to say the only important language, was a very important language for the field. So just to say that there are so many things that we have to evaluate by evaluating these successes, and we are very one-sided and very subjective about it. And I think that's for our project, and I'm very thankful for you. We have to be much more aware, and maybe to put it on the table like an open. What is our own position vis-a-vis these topics, and how does our own position influence, so to say, our standpoint in this project? So thank you.
Thank you, Mitch.
Yes, thank you. For that last point in particular, which I was trying to emphasize yesterday, you've made it much more concrete. Thank you very much. And thank you both for the really excellent papers. I want to have emphasized that too. a tiny remark about Austria, because I guess that's my responsibility in this collection. About the German passports. The passport's not valid for entry to Germany. That's correct, of course, but that meant you could go to Austria. And
hey, they were the victims.
I went into detail about that yesterday. Of course, the Israeli public never accepted this legend, but they went anyway because you could go from Vienna to Germany through routes that I can't go into here in detail, but that is what now they call in the high-tech business a workaround. Yeah, and Israelis are very good at workarounds. This already started back then. I just wanted to have added that point. The more important question is one that Dorothee raised already in her introductory remarks that I wanted to address to Ute. This is really a fascinating talk. But the question that Dorothee raised was the question about, how does one put this now? I would like to put it as the perceived objectivity of disciplines. You put it, Ute, as the internationality of disciplines, which is a very good way of putting it also. I've done that in other writings about the émigrés. The point being that I want to suggest that it is not correct, or at least that one should be careful about classifying disciplines per se as more objective or less subjective, more ideologized or less ideologized, more international or less international. Ute's remarks give us a good support for this by pointing to biblical studies and archaeology, which of course were at the time at least humanities. Archaeology is no longer part of the humanities, but at the time it was. So these kinds of assumptions that are often made in this discussion need to be questioned and historicized rather than accepted.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, Jürgen Kocker.
So, thank you both. Very small marginal point to Ute Deichmann's paper. I find it interesting that both Gentner and Avalit were in CERN when they talked about that. This role of places outside Israel and outside Germany comes back in a way, and I will talk about that shortly in this afternoon, try to remember how I got into contact with Israeli colleagues. Some of us, many of us, had some relation to the United States, to work with, for instance, with emigre scholars there in history. So there is this existence of an international network, and there are particular places, apparently like CERN, which I wasn't aware, and Berkeley and Harvard and so on, which have played a role in re-establishing contacts between German and Israeli scholars. And one might think about it. It's marginal, but perhaps interesting, at least for a historian. As to Jenny's paper, I just would like to, my impression is that a lot of that happened in the 19th, that a lot of the change we try to explain towards support of the humanities happened inside institutions like the DFG, and I think also the Max Planck Gesellschaft in the 1970s. Not erst in the 1980s, not only in the 1980s. 1970s there was important decisions, and I wonder whether you would agree with that. I mean, knowing your sources, that's my feeling from the receiving side, actually. I will talk about that this afternoon, too.
Thank you very much. You both have like 2 minutes. Okay. And as you can see, people got into a discussion with each other, which I think is very good. So you don't have to comment on everything. But if you have a question and you're willing to answer it, please do. Do I start? Okay.
Hanoch, the first question. I completely agree, but I had only 20 minutes.
My fault.
And no, but I want. Yeah, right. And I would want to use it. Clearly, there was a strong political interest in that. And I would even go further. I mean, you mentioned the Hallstein Doctrine. So Germany at that time didn't want to give political relations, didn't want to have political relations with Israel. And science support was something really much nicer at the time. In addition, I read it with Jelinek, I mean the historian Jelinek, Ben-Gurion asked for Adenauer to help him become, that Israel becomes member of NATO and also of the common market. Adenauer didn't want to do that, so science funding was a better way out. No, but also, I mean, Adenauer really wanted to help, and part of it was personal because he was helped by two Jewish friends, Heinemann and also Krauss, a professor. And he said they were the only people who helped me when the Nazis blocked my bank account, etc. So there was also this, but certainly it was a realpolitik as with Adenauer always. Another thing, yeah, so I just only, clearly Professor Koch, I agree, I mean the places outside Israel, outside Germany were of great importance. In this case, it happened to be that they were there, and it happened to be that Amos de Chalit and Gentner were charismatic people and wanted to launch it. If they had just been scientists like others, they wouldn't have done anything about it. But it was a coincidence, and so it happened relatively early. Mitch, what I was talking, and we have had this discussion before, I remember, objectivity. I still, in a way, insist on what I said. Our sciences, or the sciences, the hard sciences in general, are more, let's say, international oriented than much of the humanities. And also in the sciences there are other fields. But I just give you the examples from about which I talked. Amos de Chalit and Igal Talmi at the Weizmann Institute worked on a model that was created, among others, by Hans Gentner in Heidelberg, the atomic Schalen model, it doesn't matter. And they developed it further, and they included mathematics with which did I say before? Which was not present in Heidelberg. So it was a further development of this model, but they had the same model, they had the same atom. They were not different atoms or different models. So it was clearly an international kind of research, and Goeppert Meyer in the United States created the same model, and they shared the Nobel Prize on this, Jensen and Goeppert Meyer. So I think, and the chemical crystallography of Gerhard Schmidt, he developed it in England, in Oxford, which was the center of crystallography at the time. And he also had a chemical education, and so which was strong in Germany. And so he combined these two, and they had no problems to understand, to explain to the other why it was important. It was simply the same language, the same molecules, the same techniques, if you had them. And so I just think you don't. Yes. And
my point is, it doesn't happen automatically.
No, it doesn't happen automatically, but there are sciences in which this is much more, I mean, let's say in general more the case than in others, and in the humanities, clearly there are also differences, but one should regard this. I mean, it is not, we cannot call into question this distinction. That's what I think.
Okay, Jenny.
Okay, thank you. I'll be very short. To Jürgen Kocker, yes, I mean, I'm only starting to look at the sources. So this was an impression I had so far from few interviews, but I'm very flexible on this. I will look more into that and talk to you, and this is really just at the beginning. So, yes, I wouldn't argue on the years right now, really not. And as for Gabi Motzkin, for the Center of German Jewish History, this is interesting. We talked about it a few times inside the project, and I talked it also about with the Zeitzeugen. I asked them all the time, does that, in your opinion, have anything to do with the Israeli cooperation? And they always said, no, not at all. It's really inside Germany. These German Jewish centers were formed inside Germany because of other reasons, totally other reasons. We have to leave them. I mean, we have to discuss this. I really don't know what to do with that. And the matching in kind and endowment and how Stiftungen work, it's really new vocabulary for me. I learned about this in kind also, I heard that. And it also goes to Ifat, of course, to your comment. What I said now is, of course, taken from German administrators who have a specific view. And I also heard about this matching from Rivka Feltai. I talked to her in September, and she has problems with Tel Aviv University. But this, of course, she's unfortunately not here, so we cannot ask her. But I do think my role is not at all to say if it's legitimate or not. Of course, we have to see how people on both sides present the problem. And maybe that didn't came out right, but this is how I see my role in the project. And but it's, of course, I only do the interviews on the German side. Irene and Sharon do them here, so it's not always easy to have both perspectives in the same moment. And yes, this is, of course, an ongoing reflection how we are ourselves involved. You as principal investigators and also us. I spent a few years here, and I also benefited from German money. And it's, I mean, it's the same. My generation also, yeah. So, but I think, yeah, we continue with that. So thank you all for your remarks.
Okay, thank you all.